Now, you may say, wow, this looks like a very different video from last time. I say that's okay, because today's video is on a topic so different, so monumental, and so life changing, it deserves its own special format. Without further ado, I present the Shrimp Republic. Okay, so I want you to think about the last time you ate shrimp. Maybe it was in a shrimp cocktail at a party. Maybe it was a frozen bag from Walmart. It does not matter. Now, here's the thing there's a pretty good chance that the shrimp came from Ecuador. And the story of how it got to your plate is genuinely one of the most insane environmental stories in all of Latin America. We're talking mangrove destruction, corporate impunity, and a viral collapse that wiped out the entire industry overnight. And a government that spent 30 years looking the other way, all so the world could have cheap seafood. I'm Carl. This is from my Latin American environmental history class at Tulane University, or by Professor Chris Lane. Here is the video of the Shrimp Republic. Before the boom. Here's something I did not expect to find when I started researching this. The Incas were already doing shrimp farming. For hundreds of years, the indigenous communities along Ecuador's coast were harvesting shrimp from flooded mangrove lagoons, working with the tides, taking the ecosystem with what it offered, keeping the whole thing in balance. Low yields, sure, but sustainable. What environmental scientists would call homeostasis, a system that self regulates. Spanish settlers looked at Ecuador's mangrove coast, these dense, tangled, brackish wetland forests, and they saw nothing. Useless swamp. A historian, my professor Seitz, has a term for this: the inverse image of the native. Colonial logic held that indigenous people had no real claim to land because they were not using it in the way Europeans imagined. That framing got applied to the mangroves too. They weren't seen as ecosystems that protected coastlines, stored carbon, fed communities, and supported hundreds of species. They were seen as obstacles, wastelands waiting to be made productive. That idea, the wetland as wasteland, is the foundation that Ecuador's entire shrimp industry was built on. It's the same logic that drained the valley in Mexico, the same logic that cleared the Atlantic forest for sugar. The wild nature only counts when it's been turned into a commodity. Boom! That's what happened when modern shrimp farming in Ecuador started in 1969. A few producers set up 20 hectares of ponds in the coastline province called El Oro, pulling wild shrimp larvae out of the water and letting them grow. No feed, no hatcheries, no technology, just warm water and a species called, forgive me for butchering this, Penaeus vanemeli, the Pacific white shrimp. What happened to be perfect for farming. By 1974, those hectares had become 600. 1997 saw 3,000 across two provinces. The mid 80s saw the whole Ecuadorian coast being reshaped. In 1998, Ecuador was exporting 115,000 metric tons of shrimp per year. That's a big number. And this accounted for 26% of all private exports in the country. Now think about that. In less than 30 years, a country whose major exports were bananas and oil turned to shrimp and made it one of the pillars of their economy. And this is where it directly connects to everything we learned all semester. Eduardo Galino, my professor, cites, as he put him on the board, wrote that Latin America exists to be privileged, that the region has always been organized around extracting resources for outside markets. That's exactly what happened here. Ecuador had the coastline. The United States, Japan, and Western Europe all had that appetite. And the global markets rewarded whoever could produce the most product, the fastest, and Yes. So it also was a story of the Columbian Exchange. And weirdly enough, it just ran in reverse. Instead of old world species transforming to new world ecosystems on the way in, it's the new world species being industrialized and exported outward to serve global demand. The commodity changed every time in this course. The logic never does, though. Silver, sugar, guano, bananas, shrimp, it's all the same pattern. All these items that once came from the old world to Latin America now seem to be leaving it. The mangroves. To build all those ponds, you needed land, flat coastal water adjacent land. And the most available flat land in the coastline in Ecuador was the mangroves. By 1999, Ecuador had lost 43%, write that down, 43% of coastline mangroves. Some estimates put these figures closer to 70 by 2018. Gone, cleared for shrimp ponds. In the province, Embrasadales, apologies for the butchering, alone, which has some of the tallest, best preserved mangroves in the world, over 90% of those shrimp ponds were operating illegally. Illegally. I want to sit down for a second. Ecuador has actually prohibited mangrove clearing for aquaculture back in 1978. The law existed. It didn't do anything, though. There were no real sanctions until 1985, and from 1984 to 1999, the period when the law technically existed on paper, the industry destroyed more than the mangroves than any other point in history. There were no permits, no environmental assessments, no oversight. The industry just did what it wanted, and the state led it happened because shrimp was, well, making money. What was actually lost here isn't just the trees. Mangroves sequestered up for 4 times more than carbon per hectare than regular forests. They are nurseries. They're habitats for fish, crabs, excuse me, shellfish, and hundreds of bird species. Guano, guano, guano. They protect coastlines from erosion. They are primarily food sources and income sources for coastal fishing, and especially for women who were dependent on mangrove cockles and crabs for their communities. So when you bulldoze a mangrove for a shrimp pond, what do you think happens? Nothing good. You're not just clearing land, you're dismantling a web of ecological and societal relationships that sustain communities for generations. You're taking a common, something that belonged to everybody and was part of everyone's lives, and turning it into a private export operation. That is extractivism in the most literal form. And here is the part that really got me when I was researching this. Mangroves are not even particularly good sites for shrimp farming. How does that happen? I do not know. The soil is acidic, the water dynamics are complex, disease is, holy cow, high in risk. Researchers knew what they were getting into at this time. The industry moved away because it was fast, it was cheap, and nobody was stopping them. Whoa! That's called the collapse. Remember the Maya collapse from class? The civilization that pushed its resources past its carrying capacity, cut too much forest, altered their own regional climate, and eventually broke down. Ecuador's shrimp industry had its own version of this. And like every monoculture before it, it came in the form of the pathogen. In the spring of 1999, the white spot syndrome virus arrived in Ecuador. It had already torn through Asian shrimp industries through the 1990s, and because Ecuador's entire coast was essentially one gigantic monoculture, genetically, all shrimp were similar and packed into connected ponds sharing the same water systems. There was almost nothing between the virus and total collapse. This is what my professor calls extractive overshoot. You scale a monoculture past the point of ecological resilience. You strip away the natural buffers. the biodiversity, the wetlands, and species variety. That might slow disease. And when a pathogen hits, there's nothing to absorb it. It just runs straight through. That's the pattern that we traced with guano earlier in the semester. In principle, the mangrove coast was a renewable resource. It had sustained human use for centuries, but industries extracted a monoculture intensity which made it fragile and finite. The virus didn't create the vulnerability, the industry did, and just revealed it. Boom, boom, boom! Order, order, reckoning! That never came. After the collapse, you might expect some kind of real reckoning, a reset, a moment where Ecuador looked at its gutted coastline and reflected and thought, we won't do this again. We'll change courses. False. In practice, well, I'll get ahead of myself. Here's what actually happened. In 2008, the government launched what it called a regularization process for the shrimp industry. The stated goal was to bring everyone into legal compliance, require environmental assessments, and mandate reforestation. This never happened. In practice, it handed thousands of hectares of illegally occupied mangrove land directly back to the same companies that destroyed it without any permits for 30 years. The regularization did not punish illegal occupants. It retroactively legitimized it. Oof, I am having trouble with my English today. Fortunately, my facts are all true. And the reforestation requirements that came with the decree, many companies planted trees on completely unrelated land, technically satisfying that rule without touching the actual damage. Sound very similar to the story of guano, I might add. This is what regulatory capture looks like. The environmental protection apparatus of the state gets absorbed into the logic of the industry, and is supposed to regulate it and connect it to something we talked about a bit earlier, and I think this is called colonial logic. Earlier in the semester, the fishing communities who had lived in and off the mangrove for generations were treated as suspects. The shrimp companies were treated as producers. One group got policed, the other got land grants. Fines for 89,000 per hectare of destroyed mangroves were eventually established in 2011, but civil lawsuits for non-enforcement have stacked up since then. And in 2017, the same government that had passed the key for reforestation decree simply abolished it. That tells you everything you need to know about where the real power sat. So, where are we now? Ecuador is now one of the world's largest shrimp producers. It has surpassed every major Asian producer. Shrimp is the second largest non-oil export of the country. Production in 2020 hit 760,000 metric tons. The industry is bigger than it's ever been. And in some ways, it's better than it used to be. Direct mangrove clearing has slowed significantly since 2000. While larvae collection was banned in 2022, farms have adopted better feed management, uh, and disease monitoring has come into play. There's some reforestation happening. There's a lot of great things happening now that we've learned this and gone through it, whether it be silver mining, gold mining, coal mining, guano mining, everything that we've done in South America. But efficiency inside an extractive system is not the same thing as sustainability, I might add. Ecuador still has 230,000 hectares of shrimp ponds on a coast that has lost up 70% of its mangroves. Yikes. Certification programs meant to guarantee environmental compliance have been wildly criticized for not including coastline communities and for having regulatory gaps. And as production keeps expanding, the pressure on remaining wetlands and water quality keeps growing. The question my professor has returned to all semester is whether extraction can ever actually be sustainable. I don't think it's the case. And this gives a clear answer. The shrimp industry did not destroy Ecuador's coast because people ruining it were uniquely evil. It destroyed it because export-driven monoculture, weak state enforcement, and global consumer demand created overwhelming incentives to extract fast and push the cost onto someone else. Those incentives are still there. This is the outro. The Incans took shrimp and flooded mangrove lagoons. They worked within the systems. What replaced that over the course of about 50 years was a global industry that restructured the entire coastline to serve a consumer market thousands of miles away. And they called it development. Environmental history is not just about trees, it's about power. Who decides what land is for? Who pays when that decision goes wrong? And whether we're actually capable of breaking the pattern we are repeating. Ecuador is still the shrimp capital of the world. The question is what the title is really worth and to who. Thank you very much. I'm Carl Schilling. You have a wonderful rest of your day.